Welcome back to Dead Sleep True Crime for Bedtime. I'm Nancy Miller, and Dead Sleep is a true crime podcast made for sleeping. Which means great stories, no gore, and no obnoxious advertising. It's also a murder show for misophones. And I really mean that. If you're unfamiliar, misophonia is a disorder where the sound of other people's chewing, breathing, lip smacking, and other subtle bodily noises triggers an overwhelming and uncontrollable feeling of anger, anxiety, even rage. Misophonia affects largely women. 85% of the people who report having that feeling of rage by the sounds of other people's mouth noises. 85% are women. 85% of the people who listen to this show are women. So I hope that this podcast helps you soothe any of those external sounds as we go about our business during the holidays. Thanksgiving and the rest. Airplane rides, relatives, office parties, the sound of all that crunching and chewing and smacking and breathing. It can really make you want to kill someone. I've thought about that every time we do a true crime story, and we wonder why. What was wrong with that person? It might help to remember that there are a few of us who are secretly seething with homicidal rage every time we sit next to someone who is innocently eating a bag of baby carrots or breathing just before they take a sip of hot coffee. They are just living their lives, and we are having murderous fantasies, overwhelmed by that feeling of anger, that we want to make it stop, and we want to kill them. Of course, you're not a bad person. You wouldn't want to kill someone. You just want to make those noises stop. And this holiday season, if Dead Sleep not only helps you fall asleep, helps your anxiety and eases your insomnia, if it not only does all that, but also keeps you from killing people, strangers or the loved ones in your life who are eating almonds covered in rosemary by the fistful, and it crunching and the sound of it dropping on the front of their shirt, let's not go there. If this show keeps you from killing people, consider becoming a paid subscriber through Patreon, Spotify, and Apple Podcasts. Your subscription, your hard-earned $5 a month, it goes a long way to making sure we have the time and resources to make sure that you can rest anxiety-free and hopefully not kill anyone this holiday season. And by the way, I don't know if anyone has ever used misophonia as a defense, like a temporary insanity defense as to why they killed someone, but I'm going to look into that. And if I do find one of those stories, I'll let you know on the podcast. Tonight's episode is about a woman who had a different kind of mental breakdown, about the murder of a young newlywed, and what this woman's role was in that murder. A crisis of conscience, one experienced by the most famous true crime writer in the world. This is the third and final installment of our low-key trilogy about the life and career of influential true crime icon Anne Rule. In a murder case she found so complicated and tragic and devastating and violent that she almost quit before she even really started. And of course, Ann Rule was famous for her work on serial killer cases, like The Stranger Beside Me, where she profiled her relationship with Ted Bundy. And after that came her books about the I-5 killer, the Green River killer, along with other homicides that would have gotten lost somewhere in the back pages of a newspaper if Anne hadn't deeply reported them, brought them to light, and transformed them into best-selling books. The kind that would go on to define the style of true crime storytelling that we appreciate and watch and read and listen to on podcasts every day. So with all of the things that Ann Rule had seen, what kind of possible crime, what sort of murder would affect Ann Rule so much she felt compelled to quit true crime writing altogether? You'll find out in this episode of Dead Sleep True Crime for Bedtime. In an episode I'm calling Left Behind. Our story begins in the late 1960s when Ann Rule, then a 38-year-old struggling true crime writer, receives a plum assignment. At that time, Ann was a correspondent for a magazine called True Detective, and she was assigned a piece about a murder that had happened in Seattle just before Christmas in 1968. It seems funny now because these days true crime is a woman's genre. But back in the late 60s and early 70s, that genre of true crime, it was a man's world. Women wrote fiction, cozy mysteries like Agatha Christie. Of course, that was just a perception. There were a handful of excellent female true crime writers, and we'll likely get into those stories in a future episode. But the genre of true crime storytelling in magazines like True Detective, they were written by men, presumably for men. Ann Rule had aspirations to be a true crime writer. So Ann Rule did that by posing as a man. She wrote under a male pseudonym named Andy Stack. So of course it was Ann doing all the reporting and writing, but when it appeared in True Detective magazine, it would be under that byline, Andy Stack, which would be Ann Rule's byline for a good part of her early career. Anyway, her job as True Detective's new Pacific Northwest correspondent was to track down every lead, talk to every possible source, and find out what happened to a 16-year-old girl named Sandy Bowman. It just so happened that Ann, who was once a police officer with the Seattle PD, had some high-level connections to the department. One of Ann's closest contacts was a high-ranking police officer who was a relative of Sandy Bowman, the murdered girl. She was this cop's niece, and he really wanted this case to get solved. So to understand this story, Ann did what every good reporter does. He started at the beginning. Well, it was the beginning of this case for a girl named Sandy Bowman. December 17th, 1968 would be the last day of her life. It was supposed to be the best Christmas ever. Sandy and her new husband Tom Bowman. Sandy and Tom, they'd married young, even by the standards of the late 1960s. In that December of 1968, Sandy had just turned 16. Tom wasn't much older, maybe 17, going on 18. Sandy's mother had married young, her grandmother married young, 14, 15, 16. Sandy, like her mother and grandmother, didn't have plans to go to college, and she'd wanted to be a wife and mother. So she dropped out of high school. And by that Christmas, Sandy was excited because she and Tom found out they were going to have a baby. Sandy was 3 months pregnant. It was a welcome surprise, and Sandy swore she could already feel the baby kicking. At the very least, she was experiencing the discomfort of morning sickness. But she told Tom that wasn't going to let her stop her from doing her Christmas shopping on that December day. Tom and Sandy lived in the Kontiki Apartments in a part of Seattle known as Ballard. And that word, tiki, suggested a Polynesian flair. But in reality, the Kontiki apartment building was boxy and drab, and later covered with beige stucco. But it didn't matter. Sandy was a city girl. She dressed in the mod style at that time. Miniskirts and go-go boots, her hair was black and poofed up in a teased bouffant, with heavy bangs that framed her blue eyes, which she ringed with heavy black eyeliner, so she looked like the wafy British model Twiggy. Sandy and Tom didn't have much furniture, but what they bought were sleek pieces in the Scandinavian modern style. Tom had a factory job that paid good money, but like any newlyweds, they had to stick to a budget, especially with a baby on the way. Sandy hadn't planned on going Christmas shopping that day in December. It was bitterly cold, with an unusual amount of snow in that area, and Sandy didn't have a car. But that changed that morning when she received an unexpected little Christmas miracle. A check for $20 that a relative back in New York had sent her. $20. That was a couple of $100 in 1960s money, which meant she could buy a load of Christmas gifts for her husband, of course, and their extended family, who all lived in the area. As she and Tom ate breakfast together, Sandy told her husband that she couldn't wait to cash that check and go shopping. 2 of Sandy's girlfriends stopped by. They were also young and cool, and like people their age, they hung out, drank coffee, and listened to records, rock and jazz, and felt in a festive mood. With the snow falling and the records playing on that late morning, it was all so cozy. Just before Tom headed out in the early afternoon for his shift at the factory, Sandy asked Tom for a ride. Could he drop her off at the bank so she could cash that Christmas check? Tom said yes, but he made Sandy promise that she would be home before dark. At that time of year, the sun went down in the Seattle area around 5 o'clock in the evening. Tom didn't want her walking in the snow down the slippery streets. It was dangerous for her and for their baby. Even if, at 12 weeks, the baby was no bigger than the size of a lime. When they arrived at the bank, Sandy excitedly got out of Tom's car. Tom would later remember watching his wife as she sashayed away in her go-go boots, thinking of how lucky he was. A gorgeous new wife. A baby. He'd remember that feeling for the rest of his life. A sense of pure, unadulterated bliss he'd never enjoy again. That afternoon in December was the last time he saw his wife, Sandy, alive. Sandy and Tom were the youngest couple living in the Kontiki apartments, and they hadn't lived there very long. When they first got married, they'd moved to a different apartment building. There was something about that building, the neighborhood, or someone in it. But she told Tom that something about that place, it scared her. It felt unsafe, and Sandy wanted to move. So they'd moved into these Kontiki apartments, and they didn't know that many people, and the people they did know, their older neighbors, they harbored a bit of resentment because Sandy and Tom were social, and they kept their neighbors awake with impromptu parties and rock music and noise and sometimes the smell of marijuana. But that night, December 17th, it was dead quiet in Sandy and Tom's apartment. It was around 11:30, and Tom was just getting home from work. He usually got home at 9:30, but they needed someone to work overtime. And well, they needed the money, so he took that overtime and worked 2 hours longer than usual. Since it was late, Tom tried to be quiet as he approached the front door. He just assumed the door was locked and used his key, but the door, it swung open as if it were maybe unlocked already. As Tom stepped into the living room, the lights were on, and so was the TV. As he walked through the door, he saw something fall a couple of feet in front of him. It was an unlit cigarette, and he noticed it was a brand called Pall Mall. Where did this unlit cigarette come from? He looked behind him, and it seemed like maybe someone had stuck the cigarette on top of the door jamb over his head, which didn't really make sense. Sandy smoked socially now and then, but she didn't smoke Pall Malls. And this cigarette was one of those extra long types, and she wouldn't have slid it above their front door. Tom, he didn't smoke at all. At first, nothing else looked out of place. Their living room was messy, but it was also the holidays, and Tom saw evidence of some of Sandy's Christmas shopping with boxes and wrapping paper strewn about, along with the day's newspaper awkwardly stacked. Sandy, however, wasn't there. And again, a strange detail that stood out to Tom was that the TV was still on at 11:30 at night. Sandy always turned off the TV, even when she went into another room for a minute, to save on electricity. Then, Tom saw the note. It was propped up on the coffee table. Tom tiptoed so he wouldn't wake Sandy up. The note said that Sandy had gone to bed early. She wasn't feeling well. She knew she was only 3 months pregnant, but she could swear she felt the baby kicking. Whatever it was, she felt something moving up into her ribs, and it really hurt, she wrote in all caps. She ended the note by saying she loved him and signed it, "Love, Sandy." Tom quietly walked towards the bedroom. It was the only room in the entire apartment where the light was switched off. From the door, Tom saw Sandy's silhouette and he could see she was lying down. He almost laughed because Sandy had somehow fallen asleep, face down, at the end of their bed. It appeared she was so exhausted she just flopped down on top of the covers, didn't even get into the bed. He snapped on the light, and in an instant he realized nothing he thought he saw was true. But he couldn't believe the scene in front of him was real. At first he thought maybe she'd miscarried and passed out. How else to explain? Because on the bed, there was an unfathomable amount of blood. He couldn't make sense of it. And as he walked closer and touched her, he saw that whatever happened, she died a horrible and violent death. What he saw here, it wasn't an accident. Someone did this to Sandy. He went to use their phone, but the line was dead. He ran out of the apartment to a neighbor's place, pounding on the neighbor's door. His screams about his wife, about her murder, echoed down the otherwise silent halls of the Tiki apartments. When the police and ambulance arrived, they knew in an instant that this was a homicide. But the who did it, the when, even the how many of those injuries she'd sustained, that would take more time, beginning with the medical examiner. What they could easily see by the condition of this young woman's body was that whoever killed her, they were filled with fury, angry at Sandy, with a fiery rage that led detectives to believe this was done by someone who knew Sandy, someone who hated her. The forensic technology at that time, well, there wasn't much of it. No DNA. Even fingerprinting was a game of chance, which made those first few days, those 48 hours, so crucial in cracking the case. Especially when it was discovered that Sandy was the niece of a detective sergeant in the crime unit. If they acted fast and spoke to witnesses right away and made sense of the evidence quickly, this was a case detectives believed they could solve within those 48 hours. There appeared to be some key clues the killer left behind. From that cigarette that someone put over the door to a kitchen knife found on the scene. The autopsy later revealed someone stabbed Sandy almost 60 times. As they moved forward analyzing the evidence, they learned the kitchen knife found at the scene, along with a pair of scissors, the objects that appeared to be the murder weapons left behind by a frenzied killer, those hadn't been used to kill Sandy after all. Whoever did this, they'd taken the murder weapon with them. So detectives focused on witnesses, interviewing the neighbors while their memories were still fresh. Tom and Sandy lived on the second floor of the Kontiki. Had their next-door neighbors seen anything? Someone walking up or down the stairs? No, the neighbors said. But they heard something. At around 7:30 that night, the next-door neighbors heard shouting, a woman's voice. They said they assumed it was just the young couple having an argument, because the shouting didn't last long. One of the neighbors said she put her ear to the shared wall, just to make sure. But things got quiet, so they let it go. If only, one of the neighbors said. If only we'd gone next door to check. There were a lot of if-onlys that night. If only Tom had come home earlier. If only he hadn't worked overtime. Tom was overwhelmed with guilt. But the detectives told him it didn't matter. According to their findings, Sandy was killed sometime between 7:30 and 8:30. That would be an hour before Tom came home anyway. Investigators had a unique problem. Theirs was a case with too many clues. For a crime writer like Anne, she didn't need to gin up any red herrings. She could barely make sense of this case herself. As Anne followed the investigation, she, like the detectives, felt like she was walking in a maze. There was also an overabundance of potential suspects. Sandy was popular and attractive, with a huge social circle. Their unmarried teenage friends who still live with their parents flocked to Sandy and Tom's apartment to party. Some of them smoked weed, others, detectives learned, experimented with LSD. LSD at that time was like bath salts, an unpredictable drug that turned ordinary people into deranged animals. At least that's what people thought. And as they sifted through all of the people in Sandy's life, was it possible someone on the fringe of their social circle dropped acid and then zeroed in on Sandy, venturing over to her apartment in a homicidal daze? Then in some drug fever, attacked her and killed her. Sandy opened the door to someone she knew and didn't see the wild look in their eyes or the knife in their hand until it was too late. That was one theory anyway. Tom wasn't a suspect. Since day one, the cops knew he had nothing to do with this. He had an alibi, he was at work. And beyond that, he had no reason to kill his young bride. So who did? Within a few days, detectives winnowed down their suspect list to 3 people. And these 3 people fit into 3 classic true crime archetypes. The angry ex-boyfriend, the dirty old man, and the jealous frenemy. Detectives started with the angry ex, a kid named Lee Wilkins who dated Sandy when they were in junior high school, from about age 12 to age 14. Remember, these people were young, so for Lee, his breakup with Sandy wasn't that long ago. When she dumped him because she'd fallen in love and quickly married her new husband, Tom. When police went to Lee's house, his mother talked about how much she loved Sandy and how Sandy was like a daughter to her. They were all very close, which might have made the breakup between Lee and Sandy hurt all the more. Lee, however, swore they were just friends. No hard feelings. In fact, he admitted he'd seen her earlier that day. He told detectives he was even at her apartment that night. He'd helped her carry her shopping bags into her place at around 6:30. He swore he hadn't seen anything, and he certainly hadn't done anything. Was he willing to take a lie detector test so they could rule him out? Detectives asked. Lee said no, which was his right. But it raised suspicions, enough to warrant a search of Lee's house, where they found a collection of hunting knives. but no evidence that those knives were used in the attack. Lee, the angry ex, maybe he wasn't so angry, but he was uncooperative. Their next suspect, he was the opposite. He was too cooperative. His name was Jim Lefberg. He was at least 20, maybe 30 years older than Sandy. He was a friend of Sandy's mother initially. When Sandy's parents got divorced, her mom moved from Washington down to California. And even though she'd left, Jim, he stuck around. He was a hanger-on and seemed kind of obsessed with Sandy, and would show up at Sandy and Tom's apartment to party, which made the other kids uncomfortable. And his intensity, along with his sloppy appearance, earned him the nickname Dirty Old Man. Sandy was a nice girl, and she humored Jim. When he turned up at Sandy and Tom's wedding, unannounced and uninvited, they let him stay until, that is, he got drunk and rowdy and ended up getting kicked out of the reception. The police learned about Dirty Old Jim from Sandy's best friend, a girl named Bobby Roselle. Bobby's mother told police that the morning after Sandy was murdered, Jim appeared out of nowhere and began asking Bobby and her mother peculiar questions. What did they know? Did police have any clues? Was she stabbed in the back? Did they find the knife? Mrs. Roselle and Bobby told police they noticed Jim's clothes were wet and covered with red. Jim rambled about how he'd just finished painting a house, and these were the stains from his work. A peek into his past revealed Jim's extensive criminal record, from petty theft to grand larceny. And, rumor had it, Jim was a creep who hit on teenagers. Maybe he'd gone to Sandy's apartment, she let him in, and he'd made a pass at her. When she rejected his advances, he flew into a rage, unleashing all of his pent-up frustration in this frenzied and fatal attack. When detectives questioned Jim, he was weird. He gave them an elaborate theory, one they hadn't heard from anyone else. There was a magazine salesman, Jim said. He was going door to door. Jim asked if they'd found him. This magazine salesman was probably Sandy's killer. The cops looked into it, but nothing. But Jim wouldn't let it go. He kept coming around the police station, asking detectives about the status of the case. Bobby and her mom were convinced it was the Dirty Old Man. They swore that what was on his clothes, it had to be blood. But detectives later discovered some secrets about Bobby. When another friend of Sandy's came forward and suggested Bobby wasn't as loyal of a friend to Sandy as she might have thought. This friend said Bobby harbored a huge crush on Tom, and she was jealous of Sandy, always had been, especially now that she'd married the guy that Bobby loved. He wasn't even aware of Bobby's crush. But this friend said Bobby hung around their apartment, insinuating herself into the couple's life, maybe with a plan to break them up. What if Bobby grew impatient and went over that day to get rid of Sandy once and for all, which would make Bobby their third suspect, the jealous frenemy. Their suspicions about Bobby grew when they went to question her again and found out she'd left town. And when they looked into her departure, they discovered her mother had bought Bobby a plane ticket to California under an assumed name. With Bobby out of state, the cops kept their focus on Lee, the ex, and Jim, the dirty old man. On December 21st, 4 days after Sandy's murder, they held her funeral. Authorities used this as a time to dig deeper into their two main suspects, Lee and Jim. They arranged with Sandy's family to have both men be pallbearers, tasked with carrying Sandy's casket. They did this for two reasons: to put the men under emotional stress. Maybe they'd crack. And the second reason was to keep the men busy as the police searched each of the men's vehicles for possible evidence. They searched both of their cars. They found nothing. Slowly, they picked through the seemingly random abundance of clues found at the crime scene. The cigarette, for instance. They learned that extra-long Pall Mall that fell from the top of the front door, that was left by one of Sandy's friends, a married couple, who decided to drop by, and when she didn't answer the door, they tucked the cigarette along the door jamb. So the gesture was like a little calling card that Sandy would see when she opened the door later in the evening. She'd see the cigarette, and she'd known they'd stop by. That was their logic, anyway. The police also learned why Sandy wanted to move out of that first apartment. Tom said their place had been robbed, and Sandy didn't feel safe. When Sandy was found dead that night, her purse was found, its contents spilled out on the floor. Maybe her killer took her money, but there didn't appear to be a connection between that previous robbery and this murder. Christmas came and went, and this murder case was nowhere near solved. So many clues. But where were the connections? By January 1969, they still didn't know who the killer was, but they knew who it wasn't. Lee, the ex-boyfriend, finally agreed to take a polygraph, which he passed, along with an alibi that seemed airtight. The jealous frenemy, that was Bobby. She came back from California and was questioned by police, who determined she was a rumor mongerer and a gossip, but she wasn't her friend's killer. This murder was violent, and whoever did it was much stronger than Sandy, which the small-boned Bobby was not. Which left the dirty old man, Jim, whose sketchy behavior and criminal past made him their number one suspect. The red-stained clothing, his fixation on this case. They collected his clothes and tested the items to find out what exactly were those dark red stains. And much to their surprise, those stains. It was dark red paint, just as Jim said. A fact that was confirmed by the person who'd hired Jim for that painting job. They also discovered Jim's alibi. He'd said he was at a bar playing pool. That also checked out. It was hard to believe. They'd put their best people on this case, the entire homicide unit, and nothing. As the days, weeks, months passed, Seattle authorities had to focus their energy on other murder cases. Sandy's story faded from the news, replaced by the stories of other women, including the remains of two women found in that area in early 1969. Nobody thought those murders and Sandy's murder were connected. Not the police, and not Anne Rule. Anne did her job. She followed the case, did the interviews, gathered up all of her facts. And what she was missing was the ending. Who did it? Without an ending, this story was a mystery. So she wrote about Sandy's unsolved murder for a specific section of True Detective magazine, aptly titled The Number One Mystery, a regular section where they would write about unsolved cases. And at the end of the article, they asked for the public's help. Do you have any tips that might lead to Sandy's killer? Write us at True Detective Magazine. But that call to action, in this case, didn't lead anywhere. Things for Ann Rule. Writing under the name Andy Stack, they were only going up. The editors loved Ann's work, and they wanted her to be a regular contributor. They'd pay her $200 a story, which was good money for Ann, who was 38 years old and a single mom raising 4 kids. Ann only needed to look at the newspaper to see all of the tragedy and violence around her, especially all those young, pretty girls. She'd never run out of material. Lucky Ann. Ann didn't feel lucky. She felt sick. She was overwhelmed with what? Sadness? Ambivalence? Guilt? Why? In 1970, Ann found herself in a psychiatrist's office. She needed help. She'd worked so hard to break into this world of true crime, and now it broke her. She told the psychiatrist about how she'd published this article about this girl, a teenager, who'd been found murdered in her apartment just a week before Christmas in 1968. In the unsolved case, it nagged at Ann. But she admitted what really weighed on her mind. She made money off of the misfortune of others. Was it wrong? This psychiatrist studied Ann. And then he told her something she'd never forget. At least half of the population of the United States depended, in one way or another, on the misfortune of others for their livelihood. For starters, the psychiatrist said, look at him. Then there were insurance salesmen, firefighters, doctors, hospital workers, funeral directors, ministers, social workers. What really mattered, the psychiatrist told Ann, was how you felt about the people you write about. And once you stopped caring about the people, then you should start writing about something else. Ann decided that day that she could live with that. And when she stopped caring about victims like Sandy Bowman, then she'd call it quits. But Ann never stopped caring. She wrote over 35 books that pioneered telling true crime from the victim's perspective. She also never stopped looking for whoever it was that killed Sandra Bowman. And ironically, the case that almost made her quit was the case that spanned Ann's entire career. A quest for justice that took nearly 40 years. Around 2002, Ann heard of a cold case team in Seattle who were using the latest forensic tools to revisit and maybe solve cold cases. Ann knew Sandy Bowman's was the oldest cold case on the books, and she needed to make sure this team knew that. In this new era of forensic discovery, Sandy wouldn't be left behind. By the early 2000s, most of the people who worked that original case, they were gone, either retired or dead. Ann was herself 73 years old. So much had changed since Sandy's murder. The advancements in forensic science and criminal databases like CODIS were beyond anything anyone could have imagined back in 1969. And yet, those who worked Sandy's case, they diligently collected all kinds of evidence, including biological material from the perpetrator. And they made sure it was kept safe, in the hopes that one day there'd be a way to solve this case. forensic scientists were able to build a DNA profile of her murderer, and they fed the results into the criminal database. In 2004, they got a hit, and the results nearly knocked Anne over. All those years ago, they were certain whoever killed Sandy, it was someone she knew. How else to explain the viciousness of that attack? They were wrong. Sandy didn't know her attacker, but Ann Rule sure did. The person who killed Sandy, his name was John Dwight Cannaday. And in January of 1969, Cannaday killed 2 young women, including a young woman named Mary Annabelle Bjornson, whom he lured out of her apartment by claiming he was having car trouble and needed her help. Mary Annabelle was cooking dinner for a big date, but when her boyfriend showed up, she wasn't there. Her purse, keys, ID, all there, including the food that was still simmering on the stove. She left the house with the outfit she had on, a fancy pink taffeta dress and white high heels. Her disappearance was a mystery, until her remains were found in the spring of 1969. Anne covered John Cannaday's trial in the summer of 1969, where he was found guilty for those 2 murders and ultimately ended up in prison for the rest of his natural life. Anne never made the connection. Mary Annabelle and Sandy did have something in common. They both had family members in the Seattle Police Department. Was that a connection? In September of 2004, John Cannaday was charged with the murder of Sandy Bowman. When presented with the DNA evidence, the 59-year-old lifer threw up his hands and confessed. "I attacked her," he said. "I stabbed her." He was 24 years old at the time, and he said he had anger issues. He said he was immature back then after a divorce. He didn't know Sandy. He just randomly knocked on apartment doors in that building. Sandy just happened to open her door, and within minutes he was inside. And when she screamed, he hastily and furiously stabbed her roughly 57 times, ending Sandy's life and the life of her unborn baby. Roughly 8 years after his confession, Cannaday died in prison in 2012. Anne included the saga of Sandy Bowman in a book called Kiss Me, Kill Me, a collection of her most memorable cases, along with that indelible moment with that psychiatrist. And his advice, I think, gets to the heart of our interest in true crime and our conflicting feelings, our ambivalence about it. And I kept thinking about what that therapist said. Once you stop caring about the people, it's time to move on. I can live with that. Maybe you can too. Thank you for listening to another episode of Dead Sleep True Crime for Bedtime. I'll be back in December with a subscriber bonus episode. So be sure to sign up and subscribe so you don't miss it. Until then, nighty-night.